A sniper in Sarajevo could end your life from 800 meters away while you crossed the street to get water for your kids. The locals had a name for the most notorious stretch of road in the city. They called it Sniper Alley. And for nearly 4 years, walking down it was a calculated risk against an enemy you would never see. This is how the Yugoslav Wars were actually fought, not as one war, but as 4 or 5 overlapping ones, each with its own brutal tactical logic. Before getting into specifics, it's worth understanding what kind of war this was, because it shaped everything tactically. The Yugoslav People's Army, the JNA, had spent the Cold War preparing for one scenario: a Soviet invasion. Tito's defense doctrine was built around total national defense, a heavily armed populace, dispersed weapons stockpiles, and a strategy of fighting a protracted guerrilla resistance if a conventional invasion ever succeeded in taking the cities. The idea was that even if Yugoslavia's regular army lost a conventional fight, the whole country would become a partisan battlefield, just as it had against the Nazis. This had a critical, double-edged consequence once Yugoslavia turned on itself. It meant huge numbers of weapons rifles, machine guns, mortars, even armor were already distributed across the territory, in local territorial defense armories in towns and villages, rather than centralized. When the country fractured along ethnic lines in 1991, those local stockpiles became the seed weapons for new ethnic militias almost overnight. You didn't need to build an army from scratch. You just needed to seize the armory your ethnic group already had access to. Combine that with mixed ethnic populations living in the same towns, villages, and apartment blocks, and you get the defining tactical feature of these wars. This wasn't armies meeting on a front line. It was war inside communities, often between neighbors, fought with whatever weapons were locally available, escalating from small arms to artillery as militias formalized into proper forces. The First War in Slovenia in 1991 lasted about 10 days and is genuinely the outlier in this story, so it's worth covering quickly before getting to the wars that mattered tactically. Slovenia had almost no ethnic Serb minority and a relatively homogeneous population, which meant there was no internal civil war to fight just a fight over JNA garrisons and border posts as Slovenia declared independence. The Slovenian Territorial Defense Force used a smart, low-cost tactic. Rather than trying to fight the JNA's tanks and aircraft head-on, they blockaded JNA barracks, cut off food, water, and fuel to isolated garrisons, and waited. Many JNA conscripts drawn from across Yugoslavia, with low morale and no real desire to fight for Belgrade's authority over a republic that wasn't theirs, simply gave up rather than die for an increasingly hollow Yugoslav state. Slovenia secured independence with a few dozen combat deaths and moved on. It's barely discussed compared to what followed, but it set a precedent. The JNA was not the unstoppable Cold War force people had assumed. Croatia in 1991 and 1992 was a much harder fight, and this is where the war's real tactical character started to emerge. Croatia had significant Serb minority populations, especially in regions like Krajina and eastern Slavonia, and those communities, backed by the JNA and Serbian paramilitaries, declared their own breakaway territories rather than accept Croatian independence. The signature tactic of this phase was siege warfare against cities, and the most devastating example was Vukovar. Vukovar, in eastern Croatia near the Serbian border, was besieged by the JNA and Serb paramilitary forces for 87 days in late 1991. This is genuinely one of the most intense bombardments in post-war European history. By some estimates, the JNA fired more artillery and rocket rounds into Vukovar in those months than were fired into Sarajevo throughout its entire, much longer siege. The city's defenders, vastly outgunned and lacking heavy weapons, fought a grinding urban defense using basements and improvised positions, until the city was essentially leveled and finally fell in November 1991. What followed the fall, the massacre of patients and staff at Vukovar hospital, executed Croatian prisoners found in a mass grave at Ovkara, became one of the war's first widely documented atrocities, and a preview of a pattern that would repeat across the region. Military victory, followed by systematic killing and expulsion of the losing side's civilians. The broader Croatian War also established a tactic that would define the entire conflict. Artillery and armor dominance by JNA-backed Serb forces, who'd inherited the lion's share of Yugoslavia's heavy weapons against lightly armed Croatian defenders who initially had little beyond small arms and improvised units. Croatia spent 1991 and 1992 essentially racing to build a real army and acquire heavier weapons through covert arms purchases that, in theory, violated the UN arms embargo everyone was technically bound by while ceding territory in the meantime. That race paid off later. By 1995, Croatia's military, the HV, had transformed into a well-equipped, well-trained force. And it's worth jumping ahead briefly to explain why, because it connects directly to how the whole regional war eventually ended. Operation Storm, in August 1995, was the tactical turning point of the entire Yugoslav conflict. Croatia launched a rapid, multi-pronged conventional offensive armor, artillery, infantry, all coordinated against the Republic of Serbian Krajina, the Serb breakaway territory inside Croatia. It worked devastatingly fast. Krajina's defenses collapsed within roughly 4 days. The tactical lesson is important by 1995. The side that had been weak and improvising in 1991 had built genuine conventional military capability, with reportedly some discreet Western training assistance, particularly linked to retired American officers, helping modernize Croatian command and planning. Operation Storm also triggered a massive exodus of Krajina's Serb population. Croatia's recapture of the territory was accompanied by widespread ethnic cleansing of Serb civilians, something Croatian commanders, including General Ante Gotovina, were later tried for at The Hague, with Gotovina ultimately acquitted on appeal. Now to the conflict that defined the entire war's image in the West. Bosnia, 1992 to 1995. This is where the tactics get both more sophisticated and more horrifying, because Bosnia's ethnic geography, Muslims, Serbs, and Croats living interwoven across the same towns and regions with no clean lines anywhere, meant there was no way to fight this as a conventional frontline war. Almost the entire conflict was fought as territorial control over mixed populations, and the tactics reflect that. This is the single most important thing to understand about Bosnia tactically. Ethnic cleansing wasn't a byproduct of the war. For Bosnian Serb forces in particular, it was the strategic objective itself. The goal, articulated early on by Bosnian Serb leadership under Radovan Karadzic, was to carve out a contiguous Serb-controlled territory, what became Republika Srpska, out of a republic where Serbs, Croats, and Muslims lived mixed together. You cannot create ethnically pure territory out of mixed population centers through conventional combat alone. You have to forcibly remove the other groups. So the tactical playbook, repeated across town after town in 1992, looked like this. Paramilitary forces and local Serb police would enter a town, round up non-Serb men of military age into detention camps. Places like Omarska and Keraterm became internationally infamous, while women, children, and the elderly were expelled, often after sexual violence used as a deliberate instrument of terror and humiliation rather than incidental wartime brutality. Property was destroyed or seized, mosques and Catholic churches dynamited, so there'd be nothing to return to. This pattern repeated with regional variations involving Croat forces against Muslims, particularly in places like Mostar, and to a lesser extent Muslim forces against Croats and Serbs, though the scale and systematic nature was most extensively documented and prosecuted regarding Bosnian Serb forces, who controlled the most territory and had the most organized paramilitary and military apparatus behind them, much of it backed materially by Belgrade. If Vukovar was the worst single siege in tactical intensity, Sarajevo was the longest and most internationally visible, lasting from April 1992 to February 1996, the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. Bosnian Serb forces under General Stanislav Galic surrounded Sarajevo in the hills overlooking the city, a uniquely brutal tactical geography, because Sarajevo sits in a valley, meaning the besieging force held literal high ground over virtually the entire urban area. From those hills, Serb artillery, mortars, and snipers could hit almost any point in the city at will. This produced two signature tactics that became globally infamous: sniping civilians as a deliberate instrument of psychological warfare. The most notorious stretch, Ulika Zmaja od Bosne, became known as Sniper Alley, a long, exposed boulevard that civilians had to cross to reach the city center, hospitals or markets, under direct observation from Serb positions in surrounding buildings and hills. People sprinted across intersections, used parked buses and burned out trams as makeshift cover, and timed their movements around when snipers seemed less active. This wasn't combatants targeting combatants. It was a strategy to terrorize the civilian population into either fleeing or pressuring the government to surrender. Indiscriminate and targeted shelling, including two infamous marketplace massacres, the Markale market shelling in February 1994 and again in August 1995, where mortar rounds landed in crowded civilian market areas, killing dozens each time. The second Markale massacre was actually the immediate trigger for NATO's Operation Deliberate Force bombing campaign, which I'll come back to. The city's defenders, the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the ARBIH, were chronically underarmed throughout the siege, partly because of the UN arms embargo that locked in the imbalance from the war's earliest months. Sarajevo's defense relied heavily on dug-in urban infantry positions, tunnels, including a famous tunnel built under the airport runway that became the city's main supply lifeline, smuggling food, weapons, and fuel beneath UN-controlled territory, and a degree of improvised manufacturing, since the city was almost completely cut off from resupply for years. The UN's response to the ethnic cleansing campaigns was to declare certain Bosnian Muslim-majority towns, Srebrenica, Zepa, Gorazde, Bihać, alongside Sarajevo, as UN-protected safe areas, lightly garrisoned by UN peacekeepers. Tactically, these safe areas were a contradiction from the start, declared safe by the UN, but never actually defended with anything close to the force needed to deter a determined attacker, and located deep inside or surrounded by territory the Bosnian Serb army controlled. The safe area concept assumed deterrence through UN presence and the threat of NATO air power. When that deterrence failed to materialize with real teeth, the safe areas became traps rather than sanctuaries. Srebrenica is the starkest, most catastrophic example. In July 1995, General Ratko Mladic's forces simply called the UN's bluff. They advanced on the enclave. The lightly armed Dutch peacekeeping garrison had neither the mandate nor the firepower to stop them. Promised NATO airstrikes arrived too late and too limited to change the outcome, and Mladic's forces overran the town. What followed the systematic separation of men and boys from women and children, and the mass execution of more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys over the following days, was, tactically speaking, the logical, horrifying endpoint of the ethnic cleansing strategy that had defined the entire Bosnian Serb military campaign from its first weeks. Territorial control achieved by eliminating the unwanted population, not just displacing it. The war's military trajectory flipped in the second half of 1995, and it's worth understanding the tactical mechanics of why. After the second Markale massacre, NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force in late August 1995, a sustained air campaign against Bosnian Serb military infrastructure, command posts, ammunition depots, communications networks, and air defenses. This was the first time air power was applied seriously and sustained against Bosnian Serb forces rather than the limited, occasional pinprick strikes seen earlier in the war. Simultaneously, and arguably just as decisively, a coordinated Croatian army and Bosnian Croat Muslim ground offensive Operation Mistral and Operation Sana pushed into Bosnian Serb-held territory in western Bosnia from multiple directions, taking advantage of NATO's degradation of Serb command and air defense capability. This combined air and ground pressure, arriving at the same time, did more to shift the battlefield balance in a few weeks than 3 years of static siege warfare had managed. Bosnian Serb forces, suddenly facing both aerial bombardment and a real conventional ground threat to Republika Srpska's territorial core, were finally pushed toward the negotiating table, leading to the Dayton Agreement that November. Kosovo, 1998 to 1999, looked tactically different from Bosnia, and the difference matters. This started as a classic asymmetric insurgency. The Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, was a guerrilla force using small arms, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics against Yugoslav and Serbian security forces, operating from rural strongholds and relying on the ethnic Albanian civilian population for cover, supply, and recruitment, a fairly textbook insurgent structure. Serbian and Yugoslav security forces responded with classic counterinsurgency-turned-collective punishment tactics, large-scale clearing operations against villages suspected of harboring KLA fighters, which escalated into systematic burning of villages, mass civilian displacement, and documented massacres of civilians, most infamously at Račak in January 1999, where the killing of dozens of ethnic Albanian civilians became a major catalyst for NATO's intervention threat. Once NATO intervened in March 1999, the war became something almost entirely different tactically, a pure air campaign, with no NATO ground troops committed to actual combat. This is one of the more unusual chapters in modern military history. A war fought entirely from the air for 78 days. NATO aircraft targeted Yugoslav military infrastructure, air defenses, and eventually broader infrastructure, including bridges, power plants, and government buildings in Belgrade itself, while Yugoslav forces on the ground in Kosovo continued operations against the KLA and Albanian civilians largely unimpeded by the bombing, since modern armor and infantry dispersed in difficult terrain proved surprisingly resistant to being destroyed from the air, even under sustained bombardment. A lesson later studied closely by military analysts, since initial NATO damage assessments significantly overestimated tank and vehicle losses on the ground. The campaign's actual military effectiveness against Yugoslav ground forces in Kosovo remains debated among historians and military analysts to this day, with some arguing it was the threat of an eventual ground invasion, combined with Russia withdrawing diplomatic support for Milosevic, that actually forced capitulation in June 1999, rather than the bombing campaign alone breaking Yugoslav military capability. Stepping back across all of these conflicts, a few tactical patterns repeat again and again, and they're worth naming explicitly because they explain why this war looked the way it did, on television and on the ground. First, inherited weapons determined the war's shape before a single shot was fired. The side that controlled or had access to J&A stockpiles and heavy weapons held a massive early advantage, which is why Bosnian Serb forces dominated the early war, despite being a minority of Bosnia's population, and why Croatian and Bosnian Muslim forces spent years racing to close that gap through covert arms acquisition. Second, civilians were not collateral damage. They were targets. Sniping, shelling of marketplaces, and ethnic cleansing campaigns were not the unfortunate side effects of fighting over territory in many documented cases. Terrorizing or eliminating civilian populations was the primary military objective, because controlling ethnically homogeneous territory was the actual war aim. Third, sieges, not battles, defined this war. Vukovar, Sarajevo, Gorazde, Bihać. This was a conflict fought far more through prolonged encirclement and bombardment of population centers than through maneuver warfare between armies in open ground, a direct consequence of the mixed, urbanized ethnic geography that made clean front lines almost impossible. Fourth, outside air power, when finally applied seriously, ended wars fast. Both in Bosnia in 1995 and in Kosovo in 1999, sustained NATO air campaigns succeeded in forcing political capitulation within weeks, a sharp contrast to years of inconclusive ground fighting and half measures that preceded each intervention. The Yugoslav Wars are often remembered loosely as some kind of chaotic ethnic free-for-all. Looking at the actual tactics tells a more specific and more disturbing story. These were wars where the central military objective, again and again, was control of land through the removal of people and the methods used to achieve that, from sniper alleys to siege artillery to the killing fields outside Srebrenica, were chosen deliberately by commanders who understood exactly what they were doing.